Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting dynamic. It's about the experiences of Filipino Americans aiming for leadership roles in the workplace. We'll be looking at some potential factors behind what's often called the glass ceiling, or sometimes the bamboo ceiling.
Exactly. And to really dig into this, we're using a pretty compelling piece of research. It's titled Filipino Americans and the Glass Ceiling, a quantitative analysis of cultural adherence, assertiveness, and management. Comes from the Journal of Intercultural Communication.
Okay.
But that's not all. We're also bringing in some context, wider info about the Philippines. We've got insights from the World Bank and also the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS.
Right, to get that broader picture. So for you, the learner listening in, if you want a solid grasp on this topic quickly, without getting sort of bogged down in academic jargon, our goal here is to explore some of the potential cultural influences at play. We really want to spark those aha moments for you.
hmm The core question the research asks is this: how does holding on to Filipino cultural values connect with someone's assertiveness? And then how does that ultimately affect their chances of getting into management as Filipino Americans?
So could specific cultural norms, deeply held ones, unintentionally create some hurdles in a typical U.S. professional setting?
It's a really fascinating question, especially when you think about how large the Filipino American population is. Over 4 million people. That makes them the third largest Asian group in the U.S.
Wow. Okay.
And you see this pattern. Asian Americans generally have high education levels, right? But there's still this noticeable underrepresentation in upper management. That's the bamboo ceiling idea.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. This study seems to shift the focus slightly. It's not just about discrimination, which is often discussed. It's asking if maybe some deep-rooted Asian values might kind of clash with what's often expected of leaders in American companies.
Exactly. And one thing that comes up again and again in these conversations is communication. It seems to be a really key factor in these challenges with advancement.
Okay.
So to get a handle on this, the researchers looked at specific things they could measure. The first big one was cultural adherence, basically how strongly people stick to their ethnic values. Enculturation, they call it. And they broke that down into a couple of subdimensions.
Okay, like what were those dimensions?
Well, one was interpersonal norms. This gets at the importance people place on things like pleasing others, avoiding direct confrontation, making sure the group is harmonious.
Harmony, keeping things smooth.
Yeah. The study even mentions, Pakisama, that Filipino value of conforming, going along with the group to maintain good feelings. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. They found a statistically significant negative link between sticking closely to these norms and how assertive a person rated themselves.
Negative. So the more you prioritize group harmony and avoiding conflict, the less assertive you might tend to be.
That's what the data suggests, yeah. And statistically significant just means it's unlikely this finding is random chance. There's a real pattern there. The study gives some good examples from the survey questions to illustrate this.
Oh, like what?
Like, imagine you get poor service somewhere. Do you complain directly? Or do you maybe ask a friend or someone else to say something to avoid that face-to-face awkwardness? Or another one, are you quick to state your opinion, or do you sometimes say you understand, even if you actually still have questions or doubts? These things highlight that potential tension.
Yeah, you can really see the potential conflict there in a workplace setting.
Yeah.
What was the other aspect of cultural adherence they looked at?
It was conservatism, just general cultural conservatism. This one was a bit more nuanced in the findings. By itself, it wasn't directly linked to assertiveness.
Oh, okay.
But, and this is important, when they looked at it together with assertiveness in their bigger analysis, this conservatism did actually pop up as a factor predicting whether someone was in a management role.
Huh. That adds a layer I wasn't expecting. So it's not just one thing, it's how these factors interact. And they measured assertiveness directly, too.
They did. They used a standard tool, a short form of the Rathis assertiveness schedule. And, as you'd probably guess, management and leadership roles are generally associated with higher levels of assertiveness in most contexts.
Makes sense. And they had a decent sample size for this.
Yeah, pretty good. They surveyed 473 Filipino Americans spread across 35 states. These folks had varying levels of management experience so they could compare.
Okay, so pulling it all together, what were the really key findings that jumped out?
Well, that negative link between the interpersonal harmony norms and assertiveness was definitely a big one. The stronger someone adhered to those values, pleasing others, avoiding conflict, the lower their self-reported assertiveness tended to be.
And the flip side, which feels intuitive, is that higher assertiveness correlated with more years in management.
Exactly. That part wasn't too surprising. But the really insightful piece was the predictive power. Both things mattered for predicting management experience. Those interpersonal norms had a negative impact, while assertiveness had a positive one. And like we said, conservatism also played a role, but specifically when considered alongside assertiveness.
So it's almost like your level of adherence to certain cultural norms could influence your assertiveness, which then, in turn, seems to impact your career path toward management, at least based on this study.
That's a great way to summarize it. The study really points to that pathway, but they also looked at other factors, like how long someone had lived in the US or if they were first generation, second generation, and so on.
Ah, right. Did that make a difference?
It did, quite interestingly. They found that the longer someone had been living in the US, the less likely they were to strongly adhere to those specific interpersonal norms we talked about. It suggests that acculturation, adapting to American culture over time might lead to a shift in those values.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The longer you're immersed somewhere else.
The more you might adapt or adopt some of the local norms.
Exactly. And they saw a similar pattern with generations. Second, third, and fourth generation Filipino Americans reported significantly lower adherence to those interpersonal norms compared to first generation immigrants.
Okay.
This probably reflects the influence of mainstream American culture, which is generally seen as more, independent, individual focused, maybe more direct in communication. Okay, so that covers the study's findings on these internal cultural dynamics.
Yeah.
But we also wanted to zoom out, look at the bigger picture, the U.S.-Philippines relationship. How does that fit in?
Yeah. Connecting it outwards is important. The World Bank, for instance, notes the Philippines has strong domestic economic growth. They're making progress towards becoming an upper middle income country, and the World Bank highlights its ongoing partnership with them across various sectors.
And CSIS mentions strong economic ties with the U.S., right?
Very strong. CSIS really emphasizes that. The U.S. is a top export market for the Philippines and a major investor there. They point to things like the Luzon Economic Corridor Initiative, plus increasing U.S. investment in key areas, renewable energy, IT BPM, that's IT, and business process management,
Okay.
and even semiconductor manufacturing. So a lot of economic activity flowing back and forth.
That context is important. Does CSIS say where that investment usually goes in the Philippines?
Yeah, and that's an interesting nuance. CSIS notes that a lot of U.S. investment tends to be concentrated in Luzon, especially around Metro Manila.
So maybe not evenly spread.
Potentially,
Yeah.
yeah. It raises questions about whether the economic opportunities are distributed equally across all regions, and maybe what that means for people who have strong ties to communities outside those main hubs, communities perhaps more rooted in traditional Filipino culture.
Interesting point. Okay, and there was one more piece, something about financial services for immigrants.
Right, the Vixio report. It brings up a really practical challenge. It points out that many immigrants in the U.S., and this could definitely include Filipino Americans, often face hurdles getting fair financial services. Things like immigration status, maybe language barriers, can make it harder to build wealth, get loans, just fully participate economically.
That sounds like a significant barrier. Is anything being done about it?
Well, the report notes the rise of fintech companies, financial technology firms. Some are specifically trying to fill these gaps, offering more accessible, maybe more affordable services tailored to immigrant needs. And that's relevant because, financial well-being obviously supports overall professional success and integration.
Absolutely. And finally, you mentioned a Reddit thread. Just curious how that fits.
Oh, that was just a quick dip into a more informal space, the ARA Philippines Expats Forum. It wasn't a study, just a general discussion touching on cultural differences between the U.S. and the Philippines. It just kind of underscores the real-world complexities people navigate when moving between these cultures, how values and norms can differ and impact daily life, including, of course, the workplace.
Okay. So let's try to synthesize this for you, the learner. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
I think the big picture is this really fascinating interaction between cultural background and career progression for Filipino Americans. The research suggests that while strong community values, that emphasis on smooth interpersonal relationships, are definitely a strength. Some of those related norms, like maybe being less direct or prioritizing group needs over individual assertion, might sometimes clash with the assertiveness often expected or rewarded in U.S. workplaces.
Right, and that could contribute to those bamboo ceiling challenges we mentioned at the start.
It seems like a potential contributing factor, yes. But importantly, it's not presented as something fixed or inevitable.
Because the study also showed changes over time and across generations.
Exactly. As people spend more time in the U.S., as subsequent generations grow up more immersed in American culture, there seems to be a shift. Those specific interpersonal norms become perhaps less strongly adhered to, suggesting adaptation is happening.
So why is understanding all this important? What's the relevance for you, our listener?
Well, I think it's valuable on a few levels. For individuals, maybe Filipino Americans navigating their careers, it could offer some self-reflection, some perspective on potential cultural dynamics at play. For companies and organizations wanting more inclusive leadership, it highlights the need to understand these cultural nuances.
Yeah.
How might they affect behavior, perception, promotion?
So it's not just about individuals adapting, but also organizations becoming more culturally aware.
Ideally, yes. And just for anyone interested in how culture shapes our work lives, it's a really compelling case study. The researchers even suggested developing specific assertiveness training, maybe tailored to address those particular Filipino interpersonal norms in a supportive way.
Hmm. Okay, so final food for thought for you to chew on. Given these strong economic ties between the U.S. and the Philippines and the huge contributions of Filipino Americans, how could a better, deeper understanding of these cultural nuances actually lead to workplaces that are more fair, more inclusive? And what's the role for everyone, individuals, companies, maybe society as a whole, in fostering that kind of positive change? This study certainly gives us a lot to think about.